In the 1440s, Johannes Gutenberg invented the movable type printing press for the Latin alphabet. A few years later, he printed the Bible in Latin, which led to a dramatic explosion in the usage of printing press around Europe. According to one estimate, by the year 1500, around 1,000 printing presses were already functioning in Europe. It revolutionized the storage and transmission of knowledge, since making copies of books was much easier, faster, and cheaper. By the year 1800, more than 1 billion copies of books and manuscripts had been printed in Europe. However, it was around the end of that century that we saw printing really take off in the Islamic world, more than 400 years after being invented. So why did it take so long for the printing press to be used by the Islamic world? This video is brought to you by, well, you guys. Thanks to my patrons for supporting the channel and making these videos possible. Al Muqaddimah is funded only by Patreon, and as you can see, the videos take a long time to research, edit, and produce. And it's only because of my patrons that I am able to put this kind of time into these videos and keep them free from any kind of paywall. So if you want to pledge $1 or more to support the channel, you can head over to my Patreon. Link is in the description. You can also become a member right here on YouTube. There's some cool stuff that comes with it. Back to the video. The reason that the Islamic world adopted printing so late wasn't, contrary to popular belief, because of an Islamic hatred for technology, as Islamophobes often like to say. Muslims had worked on scientific breakthroughs pretty much since the start of Islam, in an era commonly known as the Golden Age of Islam. It was also not because of Muslim aversion to European products. Muslims had been quick to embrace other things coming out of the Western world, such as tobacco, which was so common in the Ottoman Empire by the year 1600 that it was actually banned in 1633 and then made legal and taxed a decade later. Another example of this is that papermaking had declined in the Middle East because of the Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258. Before this, Baghdad had been the world's leading producer of paper, although now the Islamic world's paper production was pretty low, and so the Muslims started importing European paper. The earliest known copy of the Quran written on European paper is dated to around 1340. By then, Baghdad and Damascus were starting to return as major hubs of papermaking, but Tamerlane sacked them both and effectively ended the industry of papermaking in these two cities. So what was the reason then? Not that long after Gutenberg's invention of the printing press, Sultan Bayezid II of the Ottoman Empire issued an edict in 1485 regarding printing in his realm. Non-Muslim communities would have complete freedom to print whatever they wanted in their languages. However, Arabic and other languages that used the Arabic script would not be printed by either a Muslim or a non-Muslim, although importation of printed Arabic books from outside the Ottoman Empire was allowed. The first printing press in the Islamic world was set up in Constantinople by Jewish refugees from Spain in 1493. Armenian and Syrian Christians were printing in large numbers as well. So why did the Sultan keep the Muslims out of printing? It wasn't because he was stupid or intolerant. Rather, I think it might have been the contrary. Bayezid and his advisors were probably smart enough to understand the disruptive power this new technology possessed. After all, only a few decades after Bayezid's edict, Europe and specifically the Catholic Church were shaken up by the Protestant Reformation, in which the printing press played a vital role. We'll return to Bayezid's reasons behind banning it, but first let's take a look at some other problems with printing in the Islamic world. Okay, so the first problem that comes to mind is just the difficulty of printing the Arabic script. First of all, let's take a look at the character meme. Depending on its position in a word, it can have one of 4 different shapes, so you'd need a much higher count of typefaces. Although in reality, that wasn't much of a problem. This photo right here is from the first ever printed Quran. It was printed in Arabic language around 1537 in Venice by Alessandro Paganini to be sold in Ottoman Constantinople, but it was full of errors, so not only was it a commercial failure, Muslims who saw it got very angry. His print shop was probably burnt, either by the Pope or by angry Muslims. Or, the more likely answer, it just ran out of business. Another cool fact. The first printed translation of the Quran was printed in Latin by Theodore Bibliander. It was published in 1543, and the introduction was written by Martin Luther himself. Luther believed that a Latin translation would reinforce European Christian belief of Islam being false. Now, if the Muslims were to accept printing, obviously it would have to start with religious books, starting with the Quran. After all, there was a reason that the first widely printed book in Europe was the Bible. However, the Quran is not the same as the Bible. It's often said that the counterpart to Jesus in Islam isn't Muhammad, it's the Quran, as a representation of God. Muslims believe the Quran to be the literal word of God as dictated to Muhammad. It wasn't meant to be read, but rather it was meant to be heard and recited out loud. The lack of importance given to writing can be estimated by the fact that the Arabic script has vowel markers that are mostly not used, so someone unfamiliar with a word would have trouble reading it even if they read the Arabic script. All written copies of the Quran were meant to store it and keep it safe from corruption, but to understand it, you'd have to listen to an expert reciting it. Even today, there's a huge emphasis on the recitation of the Quran. People recite it out loud from memory or from a printed copy. If it was to be written, it had to be carefully copied by a skilled calligrapher. When you think of Islamic art, you always think about calligraphy. Muslims took a lot of pride in their regional styles of calligraphy and illustrations. A rich tradition of book writing had appeared in the Islamic world since the transmission of paper-making technology from China in the middle of the 8th century. Even today, when you enter a mosque or other religious buildings, you can see a ton of calligraphy there. People did, and still do, copy the Quran by hand as a sign of piety and prestige. Even kings did that. So a soulless machine making copies of the Quran was seen as taking a step back from this rich tradition, a sentiment that we can relate to in modern times as well. This had been cemented in the minds of the Ottoman Empire by the terribly printed First Quran in 1537. Another reason for why printing was not adopted in the Muslim world is that it was simply not seen as solving any problems in the Islamic world. By this time, the Muslims had an established tradition of education. The Islamic education system was not reliant on books. A scholar, not a book, was the resource that those seeking knowledge had to go to. The written word was merely a tool for experts to help them remember rather than for novices to learn from. This is why famous scholars such as Ibn Arabi and Al-Bukhari traveled so much. Books were usually copied by rich patrons who had libraries that could be accessed by scholars they gave patronage to. Hence, the demand for books was not very high. Other than scholars, administrators kept records, but to accommodate them, the 20,000 to 90,000 scribes in Constantinople in the 18th century were more than enough. Also, the overall output of the Islamic world in terms of research was much lower now than it had been during the Golden Age. It was also much lower than Europe, which was going through its renaissance. Also, calligraphy was a huge industry, and at one point, calligraphers even marched to the royal palace in Constantinople carrying a coffin with their pens and ink inside to protest against printing. So their economic well-being and lobbying was also a factor. So overall, there was simply no demand for a large number of books. Like we know, without demand, even the best products might fail. Looking at you, Prince of Persia. We had actually seen something like this earlier as well. When paper was becoming popular in the Islamic world, its popularity was primarily because of its usage in the Caliphate's administrative structure and because the Quran was written on it. However, the Jews living in the Caliphate did not adopt paper as quickly as the Muslims had, because Jewish law required the Torah scroll and other traditional items to be made of parchment. Paper was only used for rabbinic publications, commentaries, and private copies of the Bible, and also secular books. So, when printing was on the rise in Europe in the second half of the 15th century, there was concern that with the widespread usage of printing, publishing books would be easier and hence radical ideas could spread more easily. This debate existed in both Islamic and Christian parts of the world, so the religious establishment wanted to preserve their version of legitimate Islam. Another thing they wanted to preserve was their own status. Of course, books being printed and made affordable for the common folk would have broken the monopoly of the religious elites on interpretation of religion, as the public would now have direct access to religious books. Similarly, it could also threaten political establishment, as any anti-state propaganda could spread more easily. So the printed word had the potential to shake everything up, from religion to government. This was probably the reason why Sultan Bayezid II banned printing in 1485. The first printing press in the Islamic world, operated by a Muslim, was by a Hungarian convert named Ibrahim Mutafarrika in Constantinople. He had previously been a diplomat and had traveled across Europe. In 1726, he wrote a treatise called The Usefulness of Printing and presented it to the Ottoman government. In it, he writes, "Books are also a tool for perfecting the nation and the state, a method of increasing the majesty of the empire and of becoming the protector and preserver, until the last day, of arts and sciences and recorded events from the miscalculation of man. If there are numerous books on history, astronomy, logic, the affairs of the state and nation, and geography, this altogether will create tremendous educational benefit. Books are a good way of creating safety from sudden catastrophes and the changes arising in the poor memory of men. In the days of the Abbasids, the books and compositions of the scholars and writers were dumped into the Tigris by the Mongols and their writings washed away." By this time, the Islamic world did have a problem that printing could help in solving. That problem was European dominance. The Ottoman Empire was starting to decline and was looking to Europe to understand how they were rising up above them. So the Sultan in 1727 issued an edict allowing Muslims to operate the printing press as long as they don't print religious texts. It was probably because of calligraphers and the clergy that religious texts were excluded from the edict. It would be another century before a religious text is published in Constantinople in 1818. In 1803, the first complete and widely accepted Quran was printed by the Tsarist Russian city of Kazan for Russia's Muslim population. The next chapter in the story of Arabic printing came when Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798. He was, as he claimed, on a mission to civilize the Egyptians, so he brought with him a French printing press and an Arabic printing press. The French one was obviously to communicate with his troops, while the Arabic one was to communicate with the locals. While his Arabic declarations had glaring grammatical mistakes, the Egyptians saw how the printing press had helped the French communicate and coordinate. So after they left in 1801, Muhammad Ali Pasha, the Ottoman governor and de facto ruler of Egypt, started using it for his own purposes. The people in his government who operated the printing press were actually sent to Italy to be trained. That's how serious Muhammad Ali Pasha was about printing. The invention of lithographic printing by Eloise Sennefelder in 1796 really simplified the process of printing Arabic. Not only did it not need typefaces, but it was also able to preserve calligraphy and illustrations the way the author intended. The first lithograph press in the Islamic world, as far as I can tell, was in Morocco, where a private citizen had bought it and religious scholars saw its usage and argued in the royal court in the favor of using it. On the opposite side of the Islamic world, India had seen the printing press pretty much since it established direct contact with Europe. Jesuits had operated a printing press there since 1556. The British East India Company also had its own presses. However, the first press owned by a Muslim came around in 1819 when Nawab Ghaziuddin Hyder Shah of Awadh sponsored one. Unlike the Ottoman Empire, the Nawab immediately started printing Islamic books. 5 years later, the British East India Company gifted a few lithographic presses to the Bombay School Book and School Society, which started printing books in local languages. Lithographic printing boomed in the Indian subcontinent. The print capital of India, Lucknow, had over a dozen presses by 1848, all operated by Muslims. The most printed language in India after English was Urdu, the language primarily spoken by Muslims. Now, the reason that the Muslims became pioneers of printing in India has something of a similar theme to the rise of printing in Europe that happened almost 400 years earlier. It happened in the context of religious reformation. By the 19th century, some 70 to 90% of the Islamic world was living under European rule. The religious elite saw the need for reformation to bring the Muslims together and fight the colonizers. We saw many revivalist and reformist movements being born in the Islamic world during the 19th century. All of them used print to spread their message. Also, the Quran was being translated into local languages throughout the Islamic world. In the 19th century, there were 12 attempts to translate the Quran into Urdu alone. None of them was widely accepted. Along with books, pamphlets, and newspapers were being published in large quantities to spread propaganda against the colonizers. So, to answer the question, the Islamic world didn't reject printing. It simply didn't think it could be useful. There was simply no problem that the Muslims thought could be solved by the printing press. Then colonization happened, and there was now a problem. In many ways, we're still in the middle of solving that problem. The so-called decolonization is still underway, and Islam is still being reformed. That's why, while Muslims were slow to adopt the printing press, we were pretty quick to adopt the internet. For better or worse, you can find all kinds of religious scholars using the internet to spread their message. What happens next remains to be seen. See you next time. Don't forget to subscribe and press the bell icon. On the screen right now, you can see the names and tiers of the patrons. You can join them by pledging $1 or more to support the channel. Thank you for watching.